Hello, everyone. My name is Julie, and I organize webinars for the Clare Boothe Luce Center for Conservative Women. I am so happy for you to join us this afternoon with our guest speaker, Ying Ma. Here at the center, our mission is to prepare women for effective leadership and to promote leading conservative women. Our materials, programs, and initiatives support ideas and efforts that are pro-America, pro-family, and support free enterprise. We encourage our supporters and students to be active ambassadors of conservative philosophy in their schools, workplaces, and communities. If you are interested in learning more about the Center for Conservative Women or applying for our internship program, I invite you to visit our website, cblwomen.org, and follow us on our social media platforms at the handle cblwomen. We thank you for joining us today as we host Ying Ma. Ying Ma is a writer, policy expert, activist, attorney, and communications professional. She is a member of our very own Board of Advisors. She's also the author of Chinese Girl in the Ghetto, a memoir about getting to know freedom from post-Mao China to inner-city Oakland, California. Ma is also a contributor to Fox News Opinion, NBC News Think, The Washington Examiner, and The National Interest. Previously, she was a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution of War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University, practiced law at Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett, managed corporate communications at Sina.com, worked on the first professional staff of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, worked on multiple presidential campaigns, and served public affairs clients in the Hong Kong office of Burson Marsteller. She received a BA in government from Cornell University and a JD from Stanford Law School. Today, Ying will be discussing her fight against legislation to introduce racial preferences in California. She will share her experience, success, and discuss the broader policy conversation around this issue. We are honored to host a key voice fighting these extreme agendas that promote inequality. Please join me in welcoming Ying Ma.
Well, thank you, Julie, so very much for that kind introduction. And I want to thank the Clare Boothe Luce Center for Conservative Women for hosting me. It's always great to chat with the Luce Center. Always great to talk to Luce ladies. And thanks very much to everyone tuning in today for spending your lunch hour with me. Now, I am going to do a PowerPoint presentation. And so I'm going to share my screen with everybody. So if you guys could give me just 1 second here. So let's see here. Start. Can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
I'm gonna assume, unless I hear otherwise, I'm assuming everyone can see the PowerPoint presentation.
The PowerPoint is on and all is well.
Okay, great. So we want to talk about defeating wokeness and identity politics today. And as many of you know, we are now in the Biden era, which means that we are in the age of racial equity. And in case you don't know what that means, let me walk you through it. So on day one, President Biden made clear that he means business when it comes to promoting racial equity. And so he issued an executive order regarding advancing racial equity. And what that said was that the whole of his government was going to be affirmatively advancing equity, civil rights, racial justice, and equal opportunity. On day 6, he issued 4 more executive orders, all to, again, promote racial equity. And in the second week of his administration, we kind of had a better idea of what racial equity really meant. His administration dropped the Department of Justice lawsuit that the Trump administration filed against Yale for discriminating against Asian Americans and whites through racial preferences in undergraduate admissions. And so that was sort of the very first real example of what this administration meant when they talked about racial equity. Now, we had a clue of what was coming during the election of 2020. Then Vice Presidential candidate Kamala Harris actually made it pretty clear because she tweeted out a video right before the November election and told us what she believed was the big difference between equality and equity. And according to her, equality may sound nice, and under equality, everyone is supposed to get the same amount. But, you know, equity means that everyone actually ends up at the same place. So what does that really mean? It means that to her, there's a problem with equality, and the problem is that not everybody starts out from the same place. And her solution for it is that equitable treatment means that we all end up at the same place. And this is the new woke order under the Biden administration. This is the new marching order for what the next 4 years at least will mean. It means that equal opportunity or equality for all is going to be racist, and that what is going to be racial justice is the equality of results, or what is commonly referred to as equity, and it means special treatment for some, and certainly based on immutable characteristics like race and ethnicity. Additionally, what this means is that you're going to have a whole lot of identity politics going around. We are going to be worshiping at the altar of identity politics for the next 4 years. There's going to be racial grievance. There's going to be a whole lot of racial preferences, racial intimidation, racial entitlement, and on and on. Now, one of the reasons I wanted to have this chat today is to tell everybody, do not despair. In fact, wokeness and identity politics were defeated in a landslide, not just anywhere, but in the very blue state of California last November. And so there is hope still for the rest of the country. And for those of you who are not familiar with this story, basically what happened in California last November was that there was a proposition called Proposition 16 on the ballot. And what it threatened to do was to remove the text on your screen from the California Constitution. And that text says, the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin. And that would apply in the 3 areas of public employment, public education, and public contracting. That seems like common sense to many of us, and that seems like exactly the kind of ideal we should live by. But no, Proposition 16 on the ballot in California last November threatened to erase that language from the Constitution. And in order to defeat Proposition 16, the state witnessed what was a David versus Goliath fight. Essentially, there were severe funding disparities. So the campaign that attempted to reinstate racial preferences basically had a funding advantage of about 16-1 to the campaign that was trying to keep equality of opportunity. So this was nearly $30 million versus $1.72 million. And then there was outsized opposition to defending equality as well. So anybody who considered themselves to be anybody in the state, so we're talking about the political establishment, the business establishment, the media establishment, the sports establishment, anybody who mattered in those areas, they all came out supporting the reinstatement of racial preferences. And you can see a whole list of people here: the governor, the Democratic supermajority, the LA Times, major corporations like Facebook and Netflix. And yet on the other side were over 8,000 small donors that nobody has ever heard of. And to give you a sense of just how powerful and how funded the campaign to reinstate racial preferences was, so PG&E is a major utilities company in California, and they donated $250,000 to restore racial preferences. Meanwhile, the state was burning. Remember all the wildfires? And then let's talk about the sports teams, the Golden State Warriors. They supported the reinstatement of racial preferences, but they were hardly the only ones. The Oakland A's, the 49ers, the San Jose Earthquakes, and so on. And, and then of course you've got a company called Kaiser, which donated $1.5 million to the reinstatement of racial preferences. That's a whole lot of money. That's almost as much money as our campaign raised during this entire election, or the election of 2020. And so what happened? Well, this is what happened. We won resoundingly. Every red area you see on this California map said to all of those people in the establishment, no, thank you. We don't want your racial preferences. We don't want your race-based affirmative action, and we don't want your grievance. And they said no to Proposition 16. And the two green areas, heavily populated, the San Francisco Bay Area and the Los Angeles area, those were the only two counties in the state that supported a return to racial preferences. And so the landslide had a margin of 14 points. This is a beautiful map. This was the upshot. Now compare that to the presidential election. Again, as I said earlier, and I don't think I need to actually tell anybody here in the audience, California is a deep blue state. And so when Biden defeated Trump in California, the defeat was by nearly 2-1. More than 60% versus about 34% or so. So nobody is claiming that this victory over racial preferences happened in some kind of deep red state in the South. No, not at all. This was not a Republican state. This was not a conservative state, but nevertheless, again, I take you back to this map. The battle against racial preferences, the battle against wokeness and identity politics prevailed, and it prevailed in all of these red areas in a very blue state. So what happened in 2020? Well, in California, we witnessed something that our campaign called the Asian American Political Awakening. Over 90% of our contributors were Americans of Asian descent. Many of them gave very small dollar amounts, $15, $75, $100, not the $1.5 million or the $250,000 that you saw in the slides I displayed earlier. And this political movement that we saw was truly exciting because it's part of a larger trend of Asian Americans saying to the woke establishment that we refuse to accept your racial discrimination, not only at the hands of college administrators like those at Yale or Harvard, but we refuse to accept all of those people who keep mouthing platitudes about diversity and representation only to inflict the collateral damage of discrimination against Asian Americans. And the actual systemic racism that we've seen over the decades and that we saw Prop 16 threatened to bring back to California was that when the state systemically discriminates against Asian people because of the color of their skin, that's not okay. That's not something that this new generation of Asian American activists will accept. And it's something that no Asian American should accept. And in fact, nobody of any color should accept. But I will say that it wasn't exactly easy. And quite frankly, even if every single Asian person in California voted with our campaign, it would not have been enough. And that's a simple political reality. And it was all the more difficult for our campaign because we were fighting in the middle of the year of America's racial reckoning. We were fighting in a year where there were race riots from BLM protests, from Antifa, and every other day you saw politicians get on TV, get in front of protesters, talking about how systemically racist America was and how much we needed to change that. And so what did they mean by systemic racism? So a prohibition of racial preferences would be racist. Speaking out against racial preferences would be racist. White people are automatically considered racist. And the country of America is systemically racist. And that was what the year of racial reckoning brought to this country. We saw millions of dollars in economic damage. We saw tons of businesses destroyed. We saw all kinds of regular citizens get beat up. And we saw all kinds of deaths, from the violence. And so I will tell you that this Asian American political awakening on its own never, ever would have had a chance against the racial reckoning that we were seeing throughout the country last year. But thank goodness, we had a broad coalition, and we had leadership, and we had moral credibility, and our campaign was fought on numerous fronts. Lord Connerly, the president of our campaign, our fearless leader, he said, you know, he, from beginning to end, provided our campaign with moral clarity, and he provided our campaign with moral credibility at a time when, during a year when we needed it more than anything else. And again, he told Americans and Californians that we can draw a direct line from the founding fathers to modern day America. And the message in that direct line is very simply that all men are created equal. And that line you can draw from the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. It ran through the Gettysburg Address delivered by Abraham Lincoln. And it ran through Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, where he, you know, said he had a dream that his children would be, you know, one day judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And ultimately, it was a message that he, along with many others on the campaign, kept reinforcing, and that is that equality is a fundamental American principle, and that this country and the state of California should not be about racial grievances, should not be about racial preferences, and that equality is something that is for everybody. And additionally, something that the kind of moral credibility that I think Ward was able to bring to this debate uniquely was that he said a lot, you know, something that many Black conservatives have said over the years, which is that these racial preferences are stigmatizing to Blacks and Latinos, and that it is the soft, you know, they represent the soft bigotry of low expectations, and that is not something that he believed was at all beneficial to the minority populations that things like Prop 16 claim to be benefiting. And, you know, and again, we had to appeal to all Californians, because even if every Asian person in the state voted for us, it still would not have been enough. And so one of our honorary co-chairs, who is truly a trailblazer, she was the first Chinese American woman to pass the bar in Southern California. She was also the first Chinese American woman to ever co-found and run a bank. And she brought the message, I think, and I think she kind of hit the nail on the head when she insisted that when the government discriminates against any racial group, it is an offense to equality for all racial groups. And this is the kind of political gravitas that Betty and Ward were able to bring to the table. On top of that, we had, our coalition had a lot of liberal supporters, because one of the first and foremost things that our liberal supporters will tell you is that racial preferences is not in line with true liberal values. And so Charles Geschecter, who's a lifelong Democrat, he was, you know, one of the more outspoken lifelong Democrats who supported our campaign. He pointed out something that I actually think is very important, and this is a quote that I always like to highlight, and that is, he said that Proposition 16 promotes a return to racial and ethnic spoil system that teaches students to label themselves and others as the oppressed or the oppressors. In this realm, no competition is fiercer than the struggle over oppression credentials. And that is not a world that Americans should want to live in. That is not a world that Californians should want to live in. It is not a world that minorities should want to live in either, because ultimately, what we want is individual responsibility, individual achievement, having to compete for who is more oppressed, which is more or less what identity politics has imposed on our society. That is something that we should very much be against. Now, the other side also was pretty overt about its real racism too. So there were those who kept saying, you know, preferences were gonna level the playing field, so on. Well, but one of their main sponsors of Prop 16 in the California legislature was someone who actually made real racist comments against Asian Americans. This quote from Cristina Garcia, a California assemblywoman, this quote came from 2014. And that was when Asian Americans launched another successful attempt to defeat a racial preferences bill in the legislature. And after that, she was so upset. She said, "This makes me feel like I want to punch the next Asian person I see in the face." Not exactly a way that you think the state should be leveling the playing field. So all in all, Californians responded to our message of equality. They responded to to our messengers. And I think overall, they simply believed in their hearts that equality is a fundamental American value. And these are people who are Republicans, Democrats, independents, people, men and women of different colors. And one of the more interesting things that emerged from our campaign was that both from pre-election polling and post-election polling, Latinos actually rejected the preferences offered by Prop 16 by huge numbers. So here you see something around, a little over 40% of them rejected racial preferences. In a poll that was conducted soon after election, we saw numbers that were quite similar. And given that Latinos are now the ethnic group that whose numbers are the biggest in the state, that matters quite a bit. And this is a group that people from the far left keep saying need racial preferences, would benefit from racial preferences. But we see in California that actually they're saying no, thank you. And in fact, one of our supporters told the LA Times that she doesn't want the stigma of racial preferences, and that she's worked very hard for her successes, and she doesn't want anybody to think that she got there by some sort of special treatment. And of course, you see the breakdown from some of the other racial groups. Now, this is, and obviously no one brought about this victory on their own. This victory did not come about through the efforts of just one person or one or two people. Anybody saying that is delivering fake news to you. In fact, a number of our senior staffers on the campaign had no prior campaign experience. And Julie mentioned earlier when she introduced me that I had worked on multiple presidential campaigns. And so I would say that this is the most inexperienced team of staffers that I've ever worked with. But the victory came about because we had a wonderful team, a very dedicated team. There's the credibility and track record of our president, Connerly, whom I mentioned earlier. Our strategist is, has got a brilliant mind, and he's a long established political strategist in California. Our vice chairs, who not only made significant financial contributions, but who brought legal and policy expertise. Our honorary co-chairs, who are sort of elder statesmen in the political arena in California. Our outreach team, folks on that team who were very eager to look beyond simply the Asian community for support. And of course, foremost amongst everybody are the Americans of Chinese descent who kind of stepped up to the plate. Many of them were fighting for equality for the very first time. Many of them displayed dedication and enthusiasm that's unparalleled. And these are our supporters, our volunteers. So this is the team that brought about the victory. This is the team that brought about the defeat of identity politics, the defeat of racial grievance, the defeat of racial preferences. And this is the team that smashed the new woke order, at least in the last election in California. And so, as I said early on, don't despair, just because we're now in the age of racial equity, and you will hear the term racial equity again and again in the Biden era. It doesn't mean that all hope is lost. And so when fighting against this paradigm, our new paradigm, be not afraid, bring the moral clarity. It's a fight worth waging. And in any sort of racial equity type of paradigm, there are always real victims, because it always institutes or implements a real kind of systemic racism. Make sure to appeal to everybody, including people across the political aisle. Ultimately, equality is for everybody, and it is worth fighting for. And it is, as Ward Connerly mentioned over and over again during our campaign, and certainly during his decades of political involvement, and I quoted him earlier, you can draw a direct line from the founding fathers to modern day. And much of what we're fighting for today is equality, American values, and common sense. And so, go out there and smash the new woke order. So I will end there. I'm happy to take any questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Ying. This is horrifying and fascinating all at the same time. I appreciate you explaining it and breaking this down for us. Even someone who's interested in what's going on in politics and culture and things like that, I hadn't heard a lot about this going on in California. So I really appreciate you bringing this to light. We have a few questions coming in. The one says, the left has played identity politics for many years now. Why do you think this racial side of things is growing and expressing itself like this so much now? Like what happened to make this such a key and ongoing? It just seems like it's person saying it, it's just compounding and it's getting a lot more intense.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. I think it has a lot to do with the death of George Floyd. And that just galvanized the movement for racial equity and so-called racial justice on the left. And so everything became about race. Starting in late May last year, the protests were, even when innocent Americans were being attacked violently, that was all supposed to be for racial justice. Defund the police is supposed to be about racial justice. And I think we're seeing this today precisely because the death of George Floyd galvanized that movement. I'm not convinced that Kamala Harris would have been picked as the vice presidential candidate if we had not seen the BLM movement and all the protests and all the violence and all the talk about racial justice last year. Then Vice President Joe Biden made it very clear to everybody that he was going to pick an African American and that he was going to pick a woman. So that was sort of his way of practicing racial preferences. Now, and I think he made those promises, and now people like Vice President Kamala Harris are going to hold him to his word. And so that's why we're going to see a lot of so-called racial justice initiatives come out of this administration. Now, let me bring this back to California. The proposition that I was talking about, Prop 16, it would not have emerged on the ballot had it not been for the death of George Floyd, had it not been for the BLM movement getting the spotlight that it did last year, because the language on the California Constitution that Prop 16 was trying to erase, that language was passed by another proposition in 1996. And since 96, there had been multiple attempts to either water down that language or to sort of skirt around it. But a lot of the legal and legislative efforts have failed, but ultimately, when the Democratic supermajority put Prop 16 on the ballot, they made it very clear that they believed 2020 was their year. They believed that the Black Lives Matter movement was going to propel them to victory, and that Americans had become so much more aware of quote unquote systemic racism that it was their time to finally repeal the prohibition on racial preferences in the California Constitution. So I think California was a microcosm of what was happening elsewhere in the country. And, you know, again, I think identity politics had, you know, as the questioners rightly observed, it's been around for such a long time, but it just became much more virulent in, you know, in the past 10 months or so.
Someone else would like to know, do you think that social media plays a role in this type of movement or issue, like with racial preferences, more than what it would have been if we would have had these type of issues without having the social media access we have now?
Well, so let me actually, let me do this. I'm gonna let me actually go back to some of the slides I displayed earlier. So, and so these slides, so this one about PG&E, this one about the Golden State Warriors, this one about Kaiser. These images were all images that our campaign displayed on social media. They're certainly not the only ones, but I mean, I think they're pretty compelling images that tell you who is funding the other side, who is actually not just verbally mouthing their support, but, you know, in PG&E and Kaiser's case, they were giving real money to it. And meanwhile, you know, here is a sports team and you've got all these woke athletes who tell you that they're for, you know, racial justice, but meanwhile, they're supporting racial preferences and racial discrimination. And so I think social media can be used by anybody and everybody. It certainly, I think it creates a different atmosphere compared to the political atmosphere you know, the country used to have when there were only 3 network channels. But it also provides a lot of opportunities. So our campaign was very poorly funded compared to the other side. Again, the funding disadvantage was 16-1. And so we didn't have any money to do TV ads. We didn't have any money to do radio ads. The other side had all kinds of money. So they basically blanketed the state of California with expensive advertising. What did we do? We were only able to afford advertising on social media, primarily on Facebook. And so that provided an opportunity for us to get our message out in what we believed was a much more cost-effective way. Now, getting our message out with images like this was not through advertising. This was just something we posted on our Twitter and Facebook and Instagram pages. And I think, and I think it was effective in the sense that a picture is worth 1,000 words. If we had made a video out of it, it would have been even more effective. So I guess at the bottom line, what I'm trying to say is I think social media has a lot of downsides. I personally really hate it. I use it because I have to. And I know you guys have a lot of, have other speakers, loose ladies who actually tell, young women how you should go about using it effectively. I'm all for that. Personally, I hate it. I think it's not a very good way to have a substantive conversation. However, one must recognize that sometimes people don't have time to have substantive conversation. So you look at this one image, it takes 2 seconds and that gets your message across. So, I guess my point is, play the game better. Don't hate the game. I mean, I kind of do hate social media, but it's just something something that we all have to contend with in this day and age. And there is a way to get effective messages out. And in our case, in the case of our campaign, I think it was helpful to us simply because, we couldn't afford to be on, to advertise on all the major networks or even local networks in California. So I hope that answers the questioner's question.
Yes, thank you. Someone else would like to know, how did the other viewpoint on this justify Proposition 16? How do they justify their actions when it would actually discriminate against people based on their race, which it seems to be the thing that we all say we don't want is racism and all of these bad things. How do they justify that?
Well, so they talked a lot about racial equity. They talked a lot about diversity, and they talked a lot about representation. So, they would say that it is simply not right to have university faculty or student body or or the folks who contract with the state to not reflect the so-called racial makeup of the state. So ultimately, they're talking about proportional representation. If the state is made up of a certain percentage of yellow people, white people, black people, brown people, so on, then everything is supposed to kind of reflect that to some extent. And if they don't get that, they're not happy. And the code word they use is diversity. I think diversity has a nice ring to it to a lot of people because you do want a diverse set of viewpoints. It is good to attract people from diverse backgrounds. Ultimately, however, for the other side, I think that was a code word for racial preferences, and they wanted proportional representation in order to get to that diversity. And one of their chief backers, another Democratic legislature, even went on an NBC affiliate in the Los Angeles area and outright admitted that if by getting to this kind of diversity and by getting to that kind of representation, it means reducing the percentage of Asian Americans in the University of California system by 50%. He was willing to do that. And so, the other side obviously is not going to come out and say they want to discriminate against Asian people or that they want to, promote stigma, but it's all couched in all kinds of language that ultimately does not actually stand up to scrutiny. On top of that, I think they provided a lot of research to back up their claims, and a lot of their research was actually just not accurate or not credible. We're very grateful to a lot of the policy researchers, the scholars, and the analysts who were on our side of the debate, who provided the data, who crunched the numbers, and who said ultimately, and one of these scholars is Professor Rick Sander from University of Los Angeles, University of California, Los Angeles. And what they showed was that when the state began to implement affirmative action based on socioeconomic factors, when the state was no longer allowed to provide affirmative action based on race, the state finally started doing the hard work. And that meant, doing more outreach in underprivileged areas. And that meant going to high schools in underprivileged areas and kind of explaining to the students and making them more aware of what the University of California admissions requirements were. And giving preferences to people whose parents, for instance, might not have had a college education. So those criteria are not based on race, but we had scholars on our side who said when in the past 25 years or so, when the state actually took that kind of an approach, things did get better. And when we did see the kind of diversity that a lot of Californians would be supportive of. It's just that the other side refused to talk about that in an honest way. But obviously, just like Kamala Harris and just like Joe Biden, they're not going to say that we're out to discriminate against people. They're going to couch their language in very sort of lofty terms.
Yes. Someone else is asking, how did people vote for Biden who supports these types of ideas and also vote no for Proposition 16? It seems a bit confusing to see that happening.
Yeah, so I have a few guesses. I'm certainly not a political strategist by any means, but I think the last election very much was about President Trump. I think there were a lot of people who did not, certainly in California. I don't think that was the case, in every state across the country, but certainly in California, a lot of people wanted Trump to go, and many of those people voted for us. And so, like I said in my presentation, our support came from Democrats, came from independents. Republicans certainly overwhelmingly voted for our side. But and I think over time people can kind of break down what happened in the Trump versus Biden race. But, COVID, I think, played a big part in it. I do believe there was a lot of discontent about how President Trump handled the pandemic. Whether that was fair or not is a different issue. And I think there was a lot of discontent, certainly a lot of hostility in California against Trump because of his personality. Now, would a different Republican have done better? Who in the last election? We don't know. And of course, lots of people felt that had it not been for the pandemic, President Trump very likely would have won re-election easily because the economy was doing fairly well before the pandemic hit. But I think all of those factors did play a role in California. And in fact, we had a number of very outspoken supporters who were never Trumpers. Some of them were independents, some of them were Democrats, but whatever they were, I think California is also kind of a strange animal because it's got a small number of Republicans. It does have a sort of an increasing number of independents as well. Democrats still outnumber everyone else, but I would say I think Trump, ultimately the last election in California, I think had a lot to do with Trump. And in our campaign, those who voted against Trump were still willing to come to our side. So it was truly kind of nonpartisan.
It was very, very neat to see. And like you said, very encouraging that people would actually take a principle and stand for it, even if they don't like a particular political side of one or the other. It was very interesting. One of the girls is asking, how did you get involved in this fight against Proposition 16? And was it like a political campaign? Like, what was the day-to-day on this, working on this, look like?
Yeah, sure, of course. So I was involved in the campaign in 1996 that put a ban on racial preferences in California. So I guess I was present at creation. So that campaign was called Proposition 209. And so the language that I read to you in the California Constitution, which said, the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to citizens based on race, sex, ethnicity, so on. That language came from Proposition 209 in 1996, and I was very fortunate to have been on the ground at the time to campaign for that initiative, and we won. I believe it was 54 versus 45, so it was a clear victory, but nothing like the 14-point victory that we saw in 2020. And many of the people who were in the last campaign were veterans who showed up again in this campaign. Our president in this campaign, Connerly, he was the chairman of the Prop 209 campaign in 1996. And I would say that was the beginning of the equality movement on a state level. So in 96, that was the first state, California was the first state to pass an initiative prohibiting the use of racial preferences and gender preferences on the state level in state, contracting, education, and employment. And then that became a model that was then exported to, I believe it was nine other states, whether via ballot initiative or legislation or executive action. So, so we saw states like Oklahoma, and a number of other states also go through a similar process. And Ward Connerly has been a leader in this fight. He's a well-known name in the conservative movement. And since 96, I kind of went on to do a number of other things. And when this, when this fight emerged again in California in 2020, I contacted Ward and asked him if he needed any help. And as it turned out, he was very eager to get some help, particularly from somebody who was there in the Prop 209 era. And then after a couple of conversations, I joined the campaign formally. Now, in terms of my day-to-day, so this campaign was unlike normal campaigns during normal times. I was part of the campaign during the COVID era. And so instead of being out there with the voters on a day-to-day basis, a lot of the work I did was done remotely. You know, a lot of phone calls, a lot of Zoom conference calls, a lot of, you know, emails, messaging, so on. And that was just the nature of the campaign. And I think it made my work different too, because I was the communications director, and I had been the deputy communications director for the Ben Carson presidential campaign in 2016. You know, and I've done communications work for a number of years now, and during, you know, so let me bring you back to the 2016 presidential campaign. I was also a member of a team that supported President Trump in a, you know, through a pro-Trump super PAC. What happened in 2016 was that you could show up at rallies in person. You know, you did a lot of TV, and the principal or the campaign would do social media and advertising, all of those things, except there was a lot of in-person contact, you know, because campaigns are about getting, you know, regular Americans involved. In this campaign, our campaign organized a lot of car rallies because, and there were some, you know, socially distanced in-person rallies as well. It's just that it was very different because of the pandemic. And so ultimately it became all the more important to get the message out through earned media. In other words, through television, through print, through online sources, through social media, through all those, and because our campaign had so little money, it made it all the more important to get the message out by getting media for free. So, you know, Fox News host Tucker Carlson, for instance, had our campaign on a couple of times, and getting that kind of free exposure was, you know, immensely helpful to us. And of course, you know, we blanketed the state, talking to conservative media, mainstream media, talking to liberal journalists, so on. We talked to, you know, anybody who was willing to have an open mind, and so I would say my day-to-day was very much done in front of a computer screen or on the phone. And that was, I think, the biggest difference. And, you know, another difference about this campaign, as I said earlier, you know, I think the previous campaigns I had been involved in, the professional staffers, almost, you know, they all tended to come with a fair amount of campaign experience. That was not the case for this campaign. And however, we did have a lot of veterans from the '96 era who provided expertise, who provided guidance, and they provided extensive coaching for the political newcomers. And, you know, and I am a big fan of our volunteers and supporters. Many of them had, you know, had limited resources, and our supporters, you know, who shelled out small dollar donations. And it was kind of obvious that they were people who weren't wealthy, and it's not like they could afford to just write a $3,500 check whenever they wanted to. And then, you know, our volunteers who spent weekend after weekend organizing car rallies, putting up yard signs, all of those folks, I think ultimately it all came together, and this was, you know, a team effort. It was a team victory, but it was a very different way of waging a campaign.
Yeah, this has definitely been a very unique year for most people, and a lot of screen time has been involved. Yeah, whether we like it or not.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Someone else is asking, how can people talk about the issues of Black Lives Matter and equity, like you're describing, when they are continuously slammed as being an avid racist because they don't follow the popular opinion? Like, how do you? So they're like, how do you argue this?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's hard. You know, I was actually on Fox and Friends recently, and Brian and I said, you know, our campaign went out and argued that we should defend equality, and Brian killed me, made sort of a funny comment. He's like, yeah, that would be very unique, because these days everybody is being maligned for their skin color. And it's true. It's totally true. I would say first and foremost, be safe. there are some environments where you just need to keep your mouth shut, because it looks like you might be under some sort of physical threat of violence, walk away, be safe, first of all. But to the extent that you can safely promote the values you believe in, that you can defend America and our creed, be not afraid. I mean, I think Zoom conferences like this, and I know that the Luce Center has provided so much in resources, as well as just in moral support to women across the country to have these civil conversations. And I think there are still plenty of forums out there where you can, voice a different kind of opinion. It's just that there is a certain amount of risk. So even if you're not under physical threat, you have to ask yourself, are you willing to be marginalized by your friends, by your colleagues, by your peers? And there are people who might say really nasty things about you on social media. And this gets back to the question that was asked earlier about the social media environment. If you get 100 or 1,000 nasty messages on social media calling you a racist, you're bound not to have a very good day. Over the years, I've gotten hate mail, a lot of hate mail, whenever I write about race-related issues. Some of the hate mail has been outright violent, and there have been occasions when I have had to ask myself, do I report this to the local police station? Those are decisions you guys will have to make. You not only do you have to think about yourself, think about your family members too, because these days people aren't only going to come after you. Take precautions. Like, for instance, if you go through my website, you would have no idea where I live. That's done on purpose. So if you're going to be out there promoting ideas that are going to be controversial, think about that. If you go on my Facebook page, you're not going to be able to find an address for where I'm doing my presentations from, and so there are precautions you can take. It's just that first and foremost, do think about your personal safety, because that's not a joke. When it comes to other things that are more about people being mean to you, or people not agreeing with you, people not liking you, that's not going to be pleasant either. So that just depends on personal preference and your personal level of tolerance for that kind of stuff. But if you're willing to put up with all that, I would say just be not afraid, because ultimately you have to be comfortable with the principles you're defending. And that's when people decide whether it's worth their while. You're not going to be able to have a backbone and defend yourself if you don't believe in what you're saying. And a lot of times when people start coming at you, and if you really do believe in the principles you're fighting for, it actually stiffens your back. And you will find that there are people near you who will kind of whisper to you, hey, I agree with you. That happens a lot too. And you will find that some people might start speaking out because they feel that they're no longer alone, and they see you doing that. And you will have to, and as I pointed out in my last slide, do point out who the real victims of this kind of racial equity agenda are. Do you point out that America is not a racist country? And some people might be in a better position to do that than others. Our campaign president, Connerly, he was born in the segregated South. I think he has a different kind of moral authority than most of us when he talks about race issues. But I guess everybody will have to find a message that works for them. And ultimately, if you decide to speak out, believe in what you say. And I think that ultimately, and you have to, and there probably will be sacrifices and setbacks. And so ultimately, if you're going to lose friends, you're going to lose financially, or if you're going to put yourself in danger, if you're going to lose privacy, ultimately just make sure that this is what you want to do. And it helps a lot if you do believe in the values you're speaking out for.
Thank you. We have time for just a few more. Someone would like to know, do you expect the Asian Americans who got involved for the first time in California to stay involved in voting in the political process?
Well, I think there are a number of Asian American groups across the country that have been galvanized in the past decade or so. This is a relatively new phenomenon because for a very long time, the so-called Asian American civil rights groups that we've seen in this country claim, I mean, many of them have tended to be pretty left-wing, and many of them have supported affirmative action. In fact, an organization that was very much out front defending Proposition 16 and promoting racial preferences in the, in our California campaign was a group called Chinese for Affirmative Action. And that name tells you everything you need to know. This is a group that, advocates for Chinese for affirmative action. And so we've seen we've seen over the decades that a lot of these so-called Asian American civil rights groups have tended to lean left. And they have claimed to speak for Asian Americans overall, when increasingly I think there are Asian Americans who don't buy that narrative, who simply reject the kind of narrative that puts them at the receiving end of racial discrimination, whether it's in the application process to Harvard or Yale, or just in everyday life, at the hands of a government that believes in the racial equity agenda. So I think we are seeing a number of groups across the country becoming more energized, becoming more mobilized. In 2019, I actually worked with the campaign in Washington State that fought a similar battle as we did in California. So Washington State is one of those states that also passed a ballot initiative some years ago in 1998, in fact, and they banned state-based racial preferences as well through a ballot initiative process. And in 2019, there was an effort to overturn that, just as there was an effort to overturn that in California in 2020. And so I worked with the campaign in Washington State to defeat that attempt. And the folks who led that battle in Washington State were also Asian Americans, many of them getting involved in the political process for the very first time. So I do think this is a movement that, is one, getting attention, and two, I think it's galvanizing a lot of new people in the political process, all of which is great. I do think that sometimes Republicans, and I would make a distinction between Republicans and conservatives, sometimes Republicans start sort of drooling all over ethnic groups that appear as if they might vote the Republican way. And then I certainly remember when Senator Ted Cruz and Senator Marco Rubio kind of splashed onto the national scene. They were very exciting for their own, for numerous reasons, but a lot of times, I saw Republicans talking to them as if they were, the Republicans' tokens, so if you Democrats have a bunch of Latinos, well, these are the Republicans' Latinos. And I think conservatives that's not the conservative way of viewing everybody. I think conservatives see identity politics in general as something to be rejected, and that we don't want to see identity politics on the left, but we also don't want to see a milder, gentler version of it on the right. And so, and so I think if Republican operatives are getting excited about, well, what does this mean for, Republican races down the road? Fine, that's up to them. That's their prerogative to do. But I think for people who hold conservative values, ultimately we need to get back to the core of what this is about. This is about equality. We don't want Asian Americans to be discriminated against, but we don't want racial discrimination against any American, anybody. That's not what this country is about. And ultimately, we want to bring everybody along because equality is for everybody. And so, in one of the slides I showed you guys, I talked about the level of support from the Latino community. In California, for our side of the issue, it was about 40%, a little bit over 40%. Those are huge numbers for a state like California. And only until we can bring everybody along, Black people, brown people, particularly those people who are perceived as the beneficiaries of the racial equity agenda. Only then will we win this battle. This is not about number, oh my God, how many yellow people are going to support us? And so ultimately, I would bring this back to the principles we're fighting for. This is about equality, and it's exciting that there are new people fighting for it, and some of them might be fighting for it for very practical reasons. There are Asian parents who don't like the thought of seeing their children getting discriminated against when they apply to college for admissions. Those are practical reasons, very valid practical reasons that voters have the prerogative to have. I do think that overall, in the end, for those of us who are conservatives, and certainly to the young loose ladies out there, I would say think about the principles you're fighting for, and think about the values that kind of lie behind all of this.
Thank you. Yes, that's what we definitely want to present, is the values and the principles, because that will be a foundation for other hard choices that you're going to have to make. If you have the right principles in line, you'll be able to make the best choices for you and the country. We have time for one more question, and this is a fun one. When will Ying run for office?
Oh my gosh. It's something I've never thought about. I have no idea. Someone asked me about the campaign, what was the day-to-day like for me? And I've never actually said this at a public Zoom. My brother unexpectedly passed away in the middle of this campaign. And so it's been very difficult for me and my family. And when the campaign ended, the first thing I wanted to do was to sort of crawl under, crawl into a hole somewhere and just, be left alone for the next 10 years. I'm slowly sort of crawling back out of that hole. And many thanks to the Luce Center for having me today. But I do think that COVID has made everything worse for lots and lots of people. And there's so many of us who have lost something, lost someone. And, in the near future, my most immediate priority is to take care of my family, and as we said earlier, everybody has to sort of keep in mind what their values are, what's important to them. And I think conservatives talk a lot about family values, and sometimes you do have to make sacrifices. At the Luce Center, I know over the years, a lot of women talk about, making choices between family and career. And there's certainly, I see all the time people on the left attacking conservative women for choosing the home over the workplace. And that's not something we want to see, simply because I think these days women ought to be able to choose, and there is nothing inferior about being a homemaker than being, out there in front of TV screens or whatever. But I appreciate the question. I guess my future is pretty hazy at this point, simply because I've got a lot of family affairs to sort out. I hope to continue to have these kinds of conversations, particularly with loose ladies across the country. I've enjoyed them over the years, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to continue them.
Well, we are very sorry to hear of your loss, but we appreciate your dedication to values that really promote the best America for everyone. And the sacrifices you made, we thank you very much. And we appreciate your dedication to truth and fairness.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for joining me today.
Yes, thank you everyone, and everyone have a lovely day.